I think we would all like to have the fewest number of fears in our lives as possible. Some might even say that fear is simply a matter of catastrophizing something or another, a specific instance. Like Dr. Aaron Beck has a 7-minute video on YouTube. He's a cognitive behavioral fellow who says that in his opinion, almost all psychiatric problems have as an underlying factor something we're catastrophizing. So my question then is, what is it we most catastrophize? Or think back to that movie with Bill Murray, I believe, and Richard Dreyfuss, What About Bob? Where Richard Dreyfuss plays a psychiatrist, and it's about a person who is questioning what is it they most fear. And he said, Bill Murray, that he feared basically everything, germs and so on. At the end of the movie, the question was answered in Bill Murray's mind that he feared death most. Buddhists, for instance, have often pursued fear management by meditating a lot on death or even going to grave sites. And even Tim Ferriss, who wrote The 4-Hour Work Week, has talked lately in the last few years about meditation on death also. And there is a man, a Mr. Chin, a lawyer by trade, who wrote at least one book on death. I don't know the exact title, Chinn, it can be looked up. And he also started a foundation, something to the effect of Freedom from Fear of Death Foundation. And in his book he talks about 4 main ways of approaching the fear of death. And then there is Dr. Kubler-Ross, I believe her name is, addressing death also, and 4 stages of accepting it, perhaps you might say. Then think too, Gore Vidal, a famous writer, and Audrey Hepburn, a famous actress who was in movies like Roman Holiday and Breakfast at Tiffany's and many other movies. Both had said at one point they're not afraid of death but the process of dying. And so the question being then, what is it we're most afraid of? That was even almost point blank to the word asked of Bill Murray by Richard Dreyfuss, once again in the movie What About Bob? Now, many would say they're afraid of something they felt traumatized in the past by coming back again. Others might say they're afraid of something in the future happening that hadn't yet happened to them personally, but they've seen it happen to someone else, and thus vicariously learned that they ought to pay attention to that and avoid it. And then there being fear. In my mind, that being labeled all too often then worry, a more polite term, a more palatable term for fear. And of course, from the religious sphere, there have been the addressing of punishment for, quote, sins, for imperfections, if you will. And it's then being debated for ages whether these imperfections were chosen or determined. Hence, in Christian doctrine, the Calvinists saying they were determined, and even suffering as per burning in flames forever being in the best interest of the universe as termed by a deity, and that we can't know the mind of the deity. So as Richard Dreyfuss then put it to Bob, What About Bob? Bill Murray played Bob. What is the question here, Bob? What is it you're most afraid of? And he said, well, it's death. Now, I used to think a couple of years ago, death is so frightening because we would have a loss of the pleasures we normally enjoy, and that bothers us so much. But as I thought about it, and thought recently again of one factor Chin was talking about, the lawyer, he said one factor in the fear of death is fear of punishment after death. He then tried to create a scenario in which we can rule out all fear of punishment after death by topics basically like saying that a loving creator would never want to punish us, and thus there's no such thing as punishment or eternal pain after death that we sometimes might worry about in the back of our mind. But my question is then, can that ever be ruled out as a possibility, punishment? Now, for instance, the Christians would want to say that once you're saved, and you can know that you're saved beyond a shadow of a doubt, well then there can't be punishment for you. Or that basically you're part of the elect. Or that if you got on your knees for 15 seconds and prayed, you're saved, and you ought to remind yourself of that fact. But then it's contradicted by those people who go to church in the Christian sphere, say, and go to altar calls over and over and over with doubts as to whether they were really saved, and how do you prove it? Faith, works, or who knows? The ultimate question, of course, being, how do you know that there won't be punishment after death by some kind of deity? How do you know a deity is even loving? For the deities of 2,000 years ago and more, Thor and who knows what, were raging. How do we know a deity actually has altruism in their heart, so to speak, if there were a deity and this created all of us? Now, some philosophers, a few like Camus, C-A-M-U-S, have said what we most fear are our thoughts. Alone in a room with our thoughts is fearful to most people. Now, again, there's so much harping, so to speak, I believe, on the fears we have concerning traumas in our past, or old age pain, and even shame over early demise, as some would call it, or income inequity, regret issues, and a deathbed, and so on. But very rarely is it ever discussed fear about punishment after death, i.e., any kind of chronic pain after death, chronic pain that lasts forever without abatement. I have one friend who was raised a certain way religiously, was very, very adamant about it, and often gave out religious tracts, pamphlets, even in elevators. And he said to me once, a year ago, that punishment in the hell is only temporary. It might go 1,000 years perhaps, and then it ends. How convenient, thus, as a way of escaping the fear of chronic pain after death. And once again, some would say that you can know without a shadow of a doubt that you're one of the elect, or thirdly, that a loving deity would never punish anyone after death chronically, that would be so vicious and contrary to a ultimate being. And of course, we're talking even if you believe in an ultimate being, and I'm going to reserve comment upon that as to my views. I think thus, in a nutshell, what all religions and what all the thinking of mankind in general can't say without a shadow of a doubt is that we just don't know what is going to happen after death. And in fact, even the word death perhaps is problematic, and the Buddhists know that well. They might like to think more in terms of a continuum. That then, I think, is one of the biggest anxiety points in a creature such as mankind, or as found perhaps on some other planets, if existing, that befalls us. To know not just that we're going to die someday, to have an awareness, but to know too that we can't predict without a shadow of a doubt what is going to happen afterward, even with the use of religion, philosophy, or what have you. That could be just wishful thinking, to think without a shadow of a doubt, there will be no pain, no chronic pain, forever and ever after death. And that, to me, is the defining issue, likely, that bothers us the most in the back of our minds, even hence the phrase by Camus and some others, that we're afraid of being alone in a room with our own thoughts. And the lawyer Chin, addressing that as one factor, he claims, and only one factor in our fear of death, seems to me that this is more than one little factor here, but a major factor. And it drives us in religion, all too often in philosophy, and it is something we simply haven't gotten a handle on or want to get a handle on, that we simply cannot predict anything, really, because we have a limited view, and we probably always will. And hence, this kind of a anxiety that I don't know there is even a term for, that simply cannot be resolved but has to be accepted. For otherwise, what are you going to do about this anxiety, about the unknown? Simply sleep 24/7, 365, or use drugs to escape? Or certainly ending your life won't be the answer, because that then doesn't resolve what would happen immediately thereafter that you're afraid of. I think the only answer is to say we have no choice in the matter but to go on and accept uncertainty in life, even after death. There's a lot of videos, for instance, on uncertainty, but they're all geared toward uncertainty while alive. I think we need to address the element that we will never have certainty about what will happen after death, and there's no way to really do anything about it, other than claiming that we should be a good person to minimize possibility of punishment. I think the Buddhists call that your karma, for instance, that if you do good deeds, your chances of coming back a better person in the next lifetime, a more happy person, will be improved. But still, that's no guarantee then that your better lot next time would be a painless life. It seems to me even the Buddhists thus miss the point here, that there's no way of predicting pain or not, even of severe nature, after death. And that's our fate as mankind. And that's what was trying to be addressed perhaps by that movie, What About Bob? But it only talked about the fear of death, and not what perhaps is more important yet, what is to happen after death that we can't possibly know about with certainty. We can have all the conjectures in the world, but no certainty about it. And it always is shape-shifting.